What is our Dharma? What is our quest? Welcome to another podcast episode of Dharma Nights. I'm Matt Murphy, and I'm going to talk today about the motif of wastelands and forests in some of our mythical quest stories or spiritual quest stories. And by no means am I going to talk about all the examples that there are out there, but just a few that have been kind of sticking in my mind lately, and I thought it'd be interesting to share. So, one of my preoccupations with this particular podcast is with the idea of quests. It has spiritual dimensions, it has real world dimensions, it has mythical dimensions, it has modern dimensions. It's an idea that can be both rooted in a mythical past in a strong and resonant way, but also kind of a torch that lights the future if you kind of wield the idea the right way. And one of my other preoccupations with this podcast is looking at some of the mythic stories that have all of this kind of spiritual valence. And there's a handful that I have particular fondness for right now, or that resonate to me a lot. And just to kind of go over the general idea within the instances of these stories, just to talk about the motif a little bit of wastelands and forests, so you guys kind of know where I'm coming from. In a lot of these stories, the forest shows up as an allegory for the place of exile that you go to in order to gain spiritual insight or strength. And the forest, in many ways, is kind of an origin point for civilization. Like at one point we departed from the forest, if indeed, we're not still one of the tribes people who still make their home in the forest. And after departing from the forest, we go on to build civilizations elsewhere. And in many cases, we actually destroy the forest of our origin, or destroy some other forest, which, could also stand in for a place of our origin that happens to be elsewhere. In many cases, we destroy these forests to build a civilization elsewhere. Like civilization comes at the expense of the forest. But wherever a forest still exists, very often it'll end up being a refuge for spiritual seekers. Certainly in the Eastern tradition, that's where a lot of the yogis and mystics go off to practice when they depart from civilization. Tapasvins, mystics, sannyasis when they don't just wander around the city, yogis, yoginis, and in the Arthurian traditions, the forest is often the place where the knights will depart to have adventures, and they'll each take their own unique path within this forest. Like they can't repeat the path of another one, and that's part of what makes their own quest special. They pick a place to get lost in the forest and go from there. Like they literally leave the trail. The forest shows up it's like a universal symbol in mythical stories. It's a place where you can be threatened with banditry from people seeking refuge in the forest from the law for less than spiritually pure reasons, right? It's a place where the natural order can threaten you, like, a hungry tiger stalking, a hungry wolf stalking. But that's also the place where civilization ends, and you can get away from civilization to do some order of self-development or seeking, or even looking for adventures, in a sense. And the wasteland has very similar ideas to this, but it's not completely interchangeable. So a wasteland is also somewhere most of the time when civilization, it's like civilization ends and the wasteland begins. Nothing grows there, nothing fertile. It's kind of under a blight. But the wasteland can also be used as a metaphor overlaid on top of civilization sometimes. Like, for example, in a lot of the Arthurian senses, sometimes one of the questing heroes would wander through a literal wasteland, but that wasteland was also a reflection of kind of the spiritual deadness of the country that they left. Like the kingdom or the country that they left was under some sort of state of spiritual castration or infertility. And that's part of what the questing knight is going on their quest to resolve. But in both cases, both in the forest and the wasteland, there's a spiritual seeking that goes on. There's a testing of what is within a person, like what's part of that person's identity in a latent way when they're apart from civilization, when they're apart from the city, like the urban environment. Or even like the agricultural environment, because an agricultural environment is not a natural environment. It's one that humans have tamed. So there are still wild things, untamed things. But in the wasteland, there's not that rich vibrancy of the untamed world. It's more just sort of like sparse wandering, and the same threat of death looms, but it looms from very different sources, like, starving to death, dying of thirst. There's still the same threat of banditry, for any of those bandits who kind of make their home in the wasteland. But there's some differences in the ideas. So, it plays a more prominent role at the top of my mind in the Arthurian legends, because they have this backdrop where, the kingdom has been sort of castrated spiritually. And this is in the backdrop of medieval Europe going, through the Renaissance, where, like right up until the Renaissance, I should say, where there was a very hierarchically organized monopoly on religion and spiritual dispensation, meaning like there was a priest, they had the authority to, perform the communion, and oftentimes they were speaking in a language that you didn't even understand. And whatever the moral character of this specific priest, they actually could have been a terrible person, like behind closed doors. But nonetheless, they had this kind of spiritual monopoly to be the intermediary between you and your ultimate salvation, because of the way the doctrine of the church was arranged. And also, this was in a backdrop at the same time where the same authority was also the authority for recognized marriages. So any kind of amorous love was was almost in a sense outlawed, which is why you get all those stories of Tristan and Isolde and their forbidden love, and Lancelot and Guinevere. That's where all of those motifs kind of come from. But the idea of the wasteland is like a concentration of all of those negative aspects of that society. And a questing knight will sometimes wander through the wasteland when they've taken a bad turn in their quest, when they've encountered some kind of failure. Like they had an opportunity to do something right and redeeming, but they messed it up. And sometimes they messed it up because they were playing out the script of their society in terms of like behavioral codes. So they make this essential kind of moral failure, and sometimes this failure along the way makes them question their faith. So they can have this very like atheistic, nihilistic journey through a wasteland where they still have adventures with sort of a darker tone. They're like wandering around in a spiritually emptied out place. And that's very different from the forest motif, where, like, for example, the Mahabharata in India, or even, the tale of the Buddha, where the Buddha goes into the forest to do his mystic searching and, to sit under the banyan tree at his immovable point. The forest is a place that's still teeming with life. It's just not civilized human life. And it still has a wild fertility. But that wild fertility needs to be tamed, not in the sense of forging a civilization, but in the sense of going even beyond whatever impulses give rise to civilization and that level of taming. So in the Mahabharata, when the Pandava brothers are born in the forest when their father's already in self-imposed exile, living amidst a bunch of mystics and yogis. So they grow up around these seekers, mystics, yogis, without an abundant life materially, but they're around all these like spiritually enriched people. Then they go into the kingdom in their childhood at a certain point, and they have this sort of risk of being corrupted by the comfort of the kingdom, like the comfort of royalty and being in the height of their particular civilization. And after they establish themselves in that world of civilization, they go into exile again through disaster, which is kind of a story in and of itself, over like a rigged gambling match with their cousin rivals. All of a sudden they have to spend 13 years in exile in the forest. But this place of exile is one that they have a more than passing familiarity with because they grew up there, and they get to go back amongst all these yogis and sages and spiritual seekers and get back in touch with the things that are less ephemerally valuable, more eternally valuable, right? There's not really quite the same concept of the wasteland in those stories as there is in the Western Grail seeking stories, but there is something kind of similar. So if we even just take the case of the Mahabharata, there's this exile within an exile that the Prince Arjuna goes through, where the rest of his brothers are in exile in the forest, and through some chain of events, which will take too long for me to describe in this podcast, Arjuna makes some sort of mistake, which then makes him take his own exile within an exile, even though his brothers beg him not to. But in his own exile within an exile, he exiles himself even from the forest and goes to the most barren heights of the tallest Himalayas. And the implication there is that he's in a way going to Mount Kailash, which is where Shiva lives. Shiva being the sort of deconstruction god or destroyer god, who's like a yogi amongst gods, right? The god who sheds off civilization, who gets back in touch with his own primal source, when he's not having to play the role of a mystic householder anyway. But Arjuna goes through the highest heights of this most barren, cold mountain where nothing grows, because that's where Shiva lives. He lives where nothing grows. And part of the whole significance of that is Shiva's spiritual essence becomes self-sufficient, or always has been self-sufficient, meaning it doesn't require sustenance. It's indistinguishable. It doesn't require food. It's one of the only things in the universe that doesn't require food of any kind. It's self-sustaining, and therefore can live in this waste up high in the mountains where literally nothing grows. So Arjuna goes alone through his own wasteland experience, and part of his mission is to collect the weapons of heaven, right? To collect all of these quote unquote astras, which are like divine weapons, and you can only really gain them in a small handful of ways, and one of them is to test the limits of your discipline and determination in both a spiritual and physical sense by going to the place where Shiva lives. And I'll actually tell that story briefly just because it illustrates some of the motifs that I was talking about earlier. So at one point when Arjuna, who's this ace archer, he fancies himself the best archer in the world, even though he probably has at least one or two rivals for that title, and he's very insecure. That's one of his only real moral failings, is that he's very insecure about whether or not he's the best archer. But he goes to this barren mountain and he encounters a hunter where there really shouldn't be any other people, right? But they're in the society of this time, there was the urban dwellers, there were forest tribes people, but then there were kind of solitary hunter figures who really lived at the fringes, not only of civilization, but also at the fringes of even wild, where wild things grow or wildlife roam. And like this hermit that he encounters, he encounters him right after Arjuna shoots a boar in this unlikeliest of places where a boar just absolutely shouldn't be. And there's a story behind that too, which I don't have time to get into, but the boar is kind of like a malevolent spirit in disguise who's tracking him unsuccessfully. So Arjuna ends up shooting this boar, but when he goes to collect the boar, which is a great prize when he's up where nothing grows, all of a sudden he has food for a few more days, right? But he sees this hermit hunter with his own bow and arrows coming to collect the boar that Arjuna thinks he shot himself. And they get in a little squabble about it. Arjuna says, "That's my boar. I shot it." And this hermit hunter says, No, that's my boar. That's my arrow. And I'm going to collect it. And Arjuna says, "Well, I'm Prince Arjuna, blah, blah, blah." Kind of throws his rank around a little bit in this place where there is no kingdom, there is no civilization, that's a meaningless concept. So the hermit says, "Oh, well, that's very nice, but are you prince of this mountain?" "I don't think so." The hermit says that. And goes on to collect the boar. Arjuna warns him and says, "Stop, that's my bow, or that's my boar, that's my arrow. I'm going to collect that boar. And if you proceed, you're going to be my next quarry." And the hunter basically laughs that off and persists in going to collect the boar. So Arjuna fires his arrow after having given that warning. The hermit's head stiffens for a moment, and you can kind of see this from behind, right? And it almost looks as though he's been shot through with the arrow, but when he turns his head, he has the arrow stuck in his teeth and spits it out. And then they get in this prolonged duel over the rights for this boar. And it's a stalemate. It's not going anywhere for like hours and hours, and I think the implication might even be for days and days. And Arjuna realizes that this hermit hunter is somehow his equal, or maybe even more than his equal, to his chagrin and surprise and dissatisfaction. So he supplicates Shiva by making a little Shiva linga, which is it's this very easy form to make out of, like you can make it out of a mound of dirt basically, and lays a garland of flowers around it to basically like supplicate Shiva for his blessings. And when he turns around, he sees that the garland of flowers that he laid over the Shiva linga is laid over the hunter's neck, meaning like this whole time he's been dueling with Shiva, the austere yogi of gods who lives where nothing grows and basically meditates on his own irreducible substance all day long whenever he's not dragooned into being a householder, right? So Shiva says that he's well pleased in Arjuna and basically grants him the boon of heavenly weapons that he asks for. So this is like a confrontation with forces that are not only not civilized, but aren't even tamed by conflict with the natural wilds. Like it's sort of like the spirit that can grow even in the most, or that doesn't grow necessarily, but is sustained even in the most barren of circumstances. And that's, if the forest is a place where you can gain adventure and spiritual expansion through disciplines and through austerities and in some contexts, in some traditions, by reconnecting with nature, right? Certainly in the Arthurian stories, because there's like a Celtic pagan undertone to all that, like the nature being the element that was exiled by desert religions being imposed over Celtic Europe and that sort of thing. But that's sort of like the wasteland motif showing up in its own way in these Eastern Hindu traditions. And certainly back to these Arthurian stories, they've started their adventure in the forest. They encountered some sort of critical failure. And in the face of this failure, they went even deeper into exile, into the wasteland where nothing grows. And the wasteland experience gives them yet another chance to succeed when basically everything else is stripped away, like in a way that in addiction support groups and so forth, they'll talk about people hitting their rock bottom. And in many cases, it's not quite hitting their own moral rock bottom, because it's not like they, betray all their friends and family and do terrible things that they have to atone for, but they reach the very bottom of their reservoir of hope or passion or motivation. And at this very bottomed out place, they have to find the last reserve of possibility, of potential and strength. And once they can connect with that, suddenly they get a renewed sense of faith. They may, along the way, have renounced their old conception of their gods or their religion. And usually what they renounce is like the form that it's practiced in the civilization that they came from, because it suddenly becomes empty to them, right? So, like in the Arthurian traditions, that this can be seen in the story of Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. There's a few different Percival or Parsifal renditions, but this one by Wolfram von Eschenbach, and while he is in the wasteland, he basically says, I hate God, right? I renounce God. And what he's really talking about is sort of the structured orthodox view of what lays between him and God, and that the way that they've conceived of God, like in that language that's been imposed from without. Because throughout Parzival's story, he gets past his own wasteland experience, and his way of achieving quote unquote yoga, as we might talk about it from the Eastern traditions, meaning like reunification with something that was alienated or separated. How he achieves his own kind of reunification or reconciliation or yoga is not necessarily through these orthodox images of God or forms or empty rituals, but by his path is through relationships, right? Relationships with people he meets along the way, people that he can perform his own personally redemptive act through, like, through his own acts of compassion, through his own acts of romantic love or platonic love that bridges the gap between his soul and another soul. So it's sort of like a way of saying, against this backdrop of Christianity, it's not about taking the sacrament and just accepting Christ's sacrifice, but it's about reproducing Christ's compassion, even if not in necessarily a martyrdom way, but in a way that, you give of yourself, and in many ways give of yourself spontaneously and thoughtlessly. And you also give yourself over to love and relationships. And this doesn't quite hit the same way in the story I mentioned earlier about the Mahabharata, although in a sense it comes close, right? So after Arjuna's way through the wasteland is, he, in that moment with Shiva, it's through devotion that he gets to it. And not necessarily a devotion that he might have done while elsewhere in other circumstances of his life, because part of the interesting thing here is, Arjuna, certainly in the Bhagavad Gita, would be generally considered as a devotee of Vishnu, right? Because Krishna, as an avatar of Vishnu, that's like Arjuna is the devotee for him. And his banner is Hanuman on his chariot. And Hanuman is the devotee God, right? He's the God who's devoted to Vishnu. So he's like he's the devotee of gods, if not the God of devotees. But nonetheless, while he's in exile, it's his supplication to Shiva, this God who is beyond civilization, right? And even beyond the wasteland. It's his connection with that outside of the civilizational forms that gives him access not only to the divine weapons, but gives him access to a point beyond even his own ego, where before he was like, I'm the prince, I'm the best archer. It's only when he gets past that last little bit of hang up that he can reconcile with this mystery from beyond and gain the strengths from that place. And it's, through an act of devotion, like the laying on of the garland, he's no longer in conflict with his enemy, but he's because his enemy in this story is that hunter, but he's actually in reconciliation and yoga and love and devotion with him. And that's the only circumstance where the fight with this unbeatable opponent stops. And we can draw all kinds of parallels in Buddhist stories, either like Indian-based Buddhist stories, or and I might do an entirely different podcast episode about this, but there's a lot that can be said in the Chinese novel Journey to the West about Sun Wukong, who's almost but not quite the Chinese take on Hanuman, right? But he's like sort of a mischievous Buddhist devotee. There's a lot of parallels there we could talk about too, and I might do that in a different episode. But this concept of going through the forest and then going through the wasteland, these aren't just like lovely ideas that we can endear to our own hearts in a very personal sense, although we can certainly do that. But when you're, the value of these stories beyond simple entertainment is that they give you kind of a spiritual vocabulary to superimpose upon your own life, to make sense of your experience and to enrich your own experience. So if, again, taking it back to the very beginning of this podcast where I started talking about quests and why they're important to me, there's a certain point in your own questing, which is like a lifelong process in many cases, where you have to say, like, what's the forest of exile that I need to go into to like gain my strengths and be reconnected with this untamed fertility, which civilization may have tamed and kind of castrated in many ways, but that is still nonetheless like fertile and almost unbounded unto itself, right? And then maybe even within that exile, there might also be an exile within an exile, like where you leave exile of the forest and go even deeper into the exile of the wasteland, right? And if you can make it through the wasteland where you're almost at your spiritual rock bottom, like you could almost argue that any good quest will contain both of these elements. There's first the very fertile, if uncomfortable space, the fertile but uncomfortable space of the forest, and then even deeper into that, the seemingly infertile, cold, not nourishing, challenging place of the wasteland. But when you can go through the wasteland, then you can go back through the forest and ultimately back to the civilization. And hopefully the quest that you're on isn't just for your own personal gain, although if it is, it's even better if that quest's output has benefits for the civilization that you departed from in order to complete this quest in the first place. And part of the messages of these stories is that any quest of value, whether or not the intention began as personal, like what it takes to accomplish that quest is ultimately bridging that gap to other people and, serving other people. So when Arjuna, for example, in the Mahabharata leaves his own exile within an exile, it's to serve his brothers. He doesn't just become the best archer in the world for his own ego's sake. That only took him so far. But it's when he goes back to be of service first to his brothers, and then ultimately, as seen in the Bhagavad Gita, which is, a story within the Mahabharata, his acts are ultimately to be in service to the highest form of the divine, vis-a-vis Krishna, right? Krishna says, when all else fails, do it in devotion to me. Make it not about yourself, but do it in devotion to me, which will be a gift to the whole world, right? So as we're formulating our quest, we might not even be completely sure what our quest is yet. Like there might be kind of like puzzle pieces on water drifting together slowly, right? But whether it's that or whether we do know what our quest is, it may be formulated in very personal terms at the beginning. But by the time that personal egoic formulation of your quest has been sort of rinsed through the process of forest exile, suddenly it takes on deeper and more fertile dimensions beyond the ego, right? Because so many aspects of the ego literally just can't exist in the forest because they're like the ego is a creature of the urban environment in many ways, or even like the rural farm environment, not the forest environment. It's very different. And it gets strained even further when whatever's left over after that forest filtering has to go through the filtering process of the wasteland. So at some point in your quest, you might have to go through a forest and then even deeper into a wasteland, and then to leave that wasteland successfully back through the forest and then back to civilization ultimately. What part of the forest and what part of the wasteland are you bringing with you in a way that's enduring and strong? And how can you pass the gifts that you gained in those environments back to the civilization from which you departed? So that's always the big money shot of the quest, is what do you bring back for others? And chances are you only accomplish that quest by connecting yourself with others and by serving others. Even if, like for fighters, they say, oh, it's just you and that other person in the ring, right? But the journey to get to that place in the ring where it was ultimately you and that other adversary was built on a pyramid of help from others. Mentors, partners, passing people, just incidentally helping along the way. And it would have been impossible without those things. So once you've taken in your quest, you got to give back, right? And the ways that you formulate how to give back, or how you come to think of the appropriate way to give back, is going to be imprinted by whatever you learned in your forest and whatever you learned in your wasteland. So hopefully that idea has some juice for some of you guys out there. It's been one that's been on my mind a lot. So whatever that forest looks like for you, whatever that wasteland looks like for you, I wish you good luck, and hopefully it's a fertile space for you.